So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sherelle Savage. I'm the Director of Community Organizing at HI. And on behalf of the staff of the DFI, myself and Laura Nicholson, we are the co-chairs of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I would like to welcome you to our third and final session on diversity and inclusion. It's personal, organizational, and communal. 3 conversations with national experts. We are grateful to the Jacob and Hilda Blaustein Fund for the enrichment of Jewish education of the Associated, which over the past 2 years has supported the diversity and inclusion training workshops and programs. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee will continue its work with DFI and the Associated to address your learning needs next year and beyond, along with the launch of the toolkit, which you'll hear more about later. In our first session a few weeks ago, we focused on the individual regarding examining implicit bias and how we show up and engage within our organizations and with our community. Our second session, we looked at leadership and diversity, being aware of including all voices, and we worked on concrete strategies to be able to do that. And today, we have with us our final national presenter, Cantor Shira Stanford Asio, who is an invested cantor through the Reconstructionist movement. Cantor Shira currently works as a program manager for the Union of Reform Judaism in the Department of Audacious Hospitality, speaking on diversity and inclusion all over the country, encouraging synagogues and organizations to be more welcoming. She also leads services and teaches at several synagogues in the San Francisco Bay Area. Prior to her work with the URJ, she was the executive director of JYCA, Jewish Youth for Community Action. She has also served as a rabbi cantor with a congregation in Arizona and as a music specialist at a Jewish day school. She previously worked as the spiritual leader and education director there. Committed to a vibrant and diverse expression of spirituality, Cantor Shira Stanford Asio has been involved with a variety of endeavors and projects. Cantor Stanford Asio also completed a degree in holistic health and worked with local organic farms in a community-supported agriculture program. She previously sat on the board of directors of the Jewish Multiracial Network, an organization that advances Jewish diversity through empowerment and community building with Jews of color and multiracial Jewish families. Cantor Stanford Asio is also a published author. Today, she will bring her wealth of knowledge and expertise, sharing with us change for the communal good, how to make small shifts that add up to audacious hospitality. Let us welcome Cantor Shira Stanford Asio.
So I'm so excited to be here. I've heard a lot about your community, and I think that even though you've had several experts, honestly, the greatest resource that you have is that you're all experts in your own communities, and you're going to bring a lot of, hopefully today, to share with each other. So we're going to go through a bunch of different ideas and opportunities and things to try on. I had the joy of actually watching the other sessions that you're in. I'm on camera too, so other people can watch this. And so I was really excited to see sort of the journey that y'all have been taking to learn both about implicit bias and about how to realize our own identities and how they fit into the larger scope of how we relate to each other and how we can challenge like who is being included and who is being excluded and how do we broaden that circle, how do we open that tent. Despite the fact that I was ordained Reconstructionist, raised in like pretty much every denomination. Spent a little time in Muncie and a Lubavitch community when I was very small, and then a conservative community, and now work for the Reform movement. I'm about as Jewishly diverse as you come, which has helped me gain a little perspective on the diverse needs of different Jewish institutions. And now I work for the URJ in their Department for Audacious Hospitality. And the objective of this department is to create inclusive community building that incorporates all of our diversity. The URJ has another department called the RAC, the Religious Action Committee, and that's really them focused on social justice facing outward in the world, dealing with immigration, dealing with poverty. I think of Audacious Hospitality as social justice facing inward. How do we broaden our own institutions and organizations to make sure that we are leveling up our level of social justice in our own communities, in our own work amongst ourselves? And so that's where a lot of this work comes from. And a lot of times we shift our practice based on someone who walks through the door and says to you, this really hurt me, or I'm really uncomfortable here. And what we're trying to do in Audacious Hospitality is preempt those conversations and start having those conversations amongst ourselves in our organizations, so we figure some of this stuff out before people walk in the door. As much as we can. There will still always be a need for feedback, but if we can already start having these conversations, which I hope is part of the reason why you're in the room, then we can help make sure that we're welcoming to that family who we don't even know is coming in yet, or this individual who's struggling in a particular way. They'll already see that we've put in some work ahead of time to anticipate them being there. Well, I'm glad you're all here, and we're gonna have some time to get to know each other just a little bit more, and we're gonna do a text study together to start thinking about these concepts and thinking about how we deal with them in our community. We'll start doing some Torah study, some text study. We wanna just start thinking a little more deeply about why we're doing this work. What is important about inclusivity, about diversity, about strengthening our community in these ways? So I have a couple of texts to start getting us thinking. We can say the blessing to our capacity. We'll say it in both Hebrew and in English. And we'll say, Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, eternal God, sovereign of the universe, who calls us to holiness through mitzvot, commanding us to engage in the study of Torah. I love the fact that la'asok sounds in Hebrew like it means in English, which is like to soak yourself in these words. So pair off, and I'll read, just for good measure, the first text, and then answer the questions with each other and get a little into it. So the first text from Genesis Rabbah says, a society and a family are like a pile of stones. If you remove one stone, the pile will collapse. If you add a stone to it, it will stand. And I wrote these originally to do with your own communities. So when it's written in our language, so that you can take it back with you and do it within you. So who may be removed from your community, but I wanted you to be able to use it when you're amidst your own community. So take a few minutes and answer the first two, the A and B questions of the first text. Does anybody want to share one or two reflections that came up from this first text?
We were saying sometimes it's hard to know who's removed, because unless they say something, do something, you're not necessarily aware.
I was saying, I think between the last three that we've had, I felt like there was this sense of that there was something like missing in the room, like that the presenters brought, and it brought me to what the word diversity really means. And I think even though you can do trainings around diversity, like diversity could mean many things to different people, and when you align yourself with being diverse internally, and whether or not that's accepted externally and welcomed into the room is a whole different, I know that doesn't quite answer the question, but I feel like it's a larger part of the answer.
So the second text that I want you to do quickly, I specifically chose because as I was talking with Cindy and Sherelle about this session, we wanted to make sure that we emphasized that each of you are impact makers in your organization at whatever level, in whatever department you're in, that all of you are coming from different types of leadership and program experience, but each of you make some kind of experience, some kind of impact, even if it's just to like be the person at the door who smiles at the person coming in the door. So we want to make sure that we think about what are the decisions that I get to make. You know, there are decisions that people make above me or below me or around me. What are the decisions that I'm making, and how can I think about what I need to shift, and how can I work with others, because none of us are in this alone. We're often doing this in community in different ways. So I'll read the second text. This one you may be familiar with, and then we'll take a few minutes to answer these questions as well. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So take just another 5 minutes just to talk. See what comes up with for you around these words. Maybe pick a different partner if you can. Does anybody want to share any thoughts that came up during this piece of text study?
When we become daunted by the work, like all the time, right? It's just a lot of big work. And the two of us both said, well, we know each other, that what skills we bring is sort of, we both are people who notice a lot. So if there is something that isn't inclusive, or if somebody is feeling not necessarily included, we tend to notice that. And then that's like sort of the first step in figuring out what to do about it.
Anybody else want to share?
So our group talked about how one of our structural issues that we struggle with as a community-facing organization on a lot of different levels is around when we schedule events. So we have a diverse community that we engage with that's inclusive of African American, Jewish, and Latinx community members, all different religions, but because of our connection to the Associated and their rules and guidelines, we are very limited on when we can hold events. So it automatically excludes 2/3 of our community when we are considering when we can hold an activity in the community. And we have to constantly tell our African American and Latinx community members, well, we can't have anything on Saturday unless it's after a certain time because of being an agency of the Associated.
Right.
So we carry that. I think we carry that tension as individuals, that we have to constantly be those messengers, but then we also have to try to juggle what we can and can't do in community, which also is daunting. And I would say we carry that every day.
So that leads exactly kind of to what I want you to do now, which is in front of all of you are little sticky notes. When I go across the country and I talk to people about this, a lot of them are like, tell me what other places are doing. What's working for them? And so I want you to tell each other some of this. So if you could take just a little handful of sticky notes for yourself, what I'm going to ask you to do is do one or two for each of the posters that I have up, and write down one or two things that you have been doing, because I know you've been at least thinking about this for the few months that this series has been going on, but thinking about what in your communities is currently working. So something that you've instituted recently is currently working to include more people. Is there anything that you've been doing that has been successful? And then is there anything, so put that on one sticky note, and I'm gonna like release you at tables like at a bar mitzvah, and you'll go up and put them on the poster. And then take another sticky note and tell us, is there something that you tried that just failed? Is there something that you tried that was just too difficult, it didn't work, or you're still challenging, it's still a challenge to make it work? And the third thing is something you want to try. And hopefully as we proceed this morning, we're going to touch on these different pieces in different ways. So, and they can be anonymous. You don't have to claim that it's you. But so one thing that you've tried and is working, and if you don't have anything, it's okay too. One thing, whether it's changing the language that you're using around certain issues. I'm going to let you define it, because I think this is really just, I don't want to direct this too much. I want one thing around diversity inclusion that is working, one thing that has been a struggle or just isn't working, but you've tried it, so you deserve some credit for trying, and one thing you'd like to try but haven't started yet. We're going to keep going back to these posters. I'm not going to look at them right now, but I wanted us to kind of get that out and start thinking about what it is we're really doing. This session is really about action and policies and shifting real, tangible things. I think we have to, there's different actually theories on whether we need to change our minds or our hearts first, or change our policies first, and our hearts and minds will catch up. And I think we can do all three. We need to do all three. But I want to talk about the power of just changing policy and changing action and changing structure. But we want to look at why we do it. We want to talk about why. And in the work of Audacious Hospitality, we have certain principles, but I know all of you have mission statements, you have values, sometimes Jewish values that you work with, you struggle with, to incorporate in your work. So it's important, I think, because change is hard, because we are challenged to sometimes make changes and there's some resistance, we have to keep going back to our values of why we're making change in order to sort of help give a little bit of the push. So I'm going to talk about the values that my department is working with in trying to look at this work, but you have to think of your own structure and your own organization and what values you're working with. One of the resources that we've developed is we have an Audacious Hospitality toolkit that's available online. And what we've done is we've created resources for each of these values. So the first one is welcome, is Ohel Patuach, is an open tent, to think about the fact that we're stronger when our doors are open. I think that in communities it can be complicated. There can be a lot of safety in closing the doors. There can be a lot of comfort. I sometimes say that people actually don't want community. Community is really hard. What people want is a clique. What people want is a small group of people who know them well, who are conscious of their whereabouts, who have their back, who will take care of them. And what we often are hoping to do in communities is give people some context to form a clique. But when we are really working on community, we want to make sure that we have the community that we want to see, and that even if we have a small group within that community that looks out for us, that small group is as interesting and diverse and open. I think we live in a culture that has not supported us having authentic relationships across lines of gender, across lines of race, across ethnicities. And part of this work is attempting to build the skills it takes to have those authentic relationships.
And when you say the term clique, that sounds to me like it's a group that is exclusive of others.
I guess that's what I'm saying. I think whether we admit it or not, a lot of our instinct is to want a little exclusive group, right? I want my little exclusive group that feels good to me. I think I'm mentioning that as what the primal desire is, and why it's so hard to sometimes work against that. To say, but that's not actually my value, right? That is something that I might think is going to keep me safe, but it actually doesn't keep me as healthy and aware and conscious and growing and learning as I can be. And my value is to have an open tent. My value is to have a community that's broad and diverse. And so I have to resist that desire to just have something that is familiar and safe. And that can be challenging. And we have to push ourselves a little bit to work beyond that. So we have to think, even if we have that drive, we have this value to balance it out. So what do we have to do? We have to be watchful. We have to be conscious. We have to look at what we're doing. We have to assess what's happening in our organizations, which can also be hard. The next value is to learn, to have knowledge and self-awareness, so that we are consistently learning on this process. One of the difficult things about doing this work is that a lot of us as adults think we have it all figured out. And so it's really hard to say, actually, on this topic, I don't know everything. There's a lot for me to learn. Particularly in this country, we don't talk about issues of race or even issues of gender and sexuality openly. And when you don't talk about something openly, you don't learn about it and you don't know how to navigate it, and you have a little bit of a stunted understanding of it. And so if you only start talking about these things once you're much older, you can feel insecure because you've talked about so many other things your whole life with a level of openness that these topics have not been afforded, that it has not felt safe to talk about our differences comfortably. We don't know how to do it. It makes us uncomfortable. And so we have to be willing to learn, and we have to be willing in that learning to admit we don't know everything, and we can make mistakes in the process. The next value is kavod, to honor someone, that as we're learning, that we do it from a place of respect, that we take a step back and honor the essence in everyone that we encounter, and that we also do it from a place of appreciation. I watched the Sherry Brown, and she talked about appreciations of taking time in a meeting or in the structure of your organization to really appreciate everyone there. And as you start appreciating everyone and noticing what they're bringing, it's another way to expand the tent and open up and realize like who you're really in community with. So the last two values are courage and compassion, ometz lev v'rachamim, which here it says when the rubber meets the road, to say that because we may be learning new things, because we may be changing things, we're like, why do I have to change that? Or if I change that, someone is going to complain or someone is going to attack us, right? If we put an LGBTQ flag in front of our building as a sign of support, someone is going to attack us. I just came from doing a session in Georgia where there were people from all over the South, and that was something they were really concerned about, is if we start making these changes, is that going to make us a target? Depending on what kind of community you are in, and depending on what kind of changes you're making, you may have to face different issues of courage. But a lot of that comes into it. What if I fail? Right? What if this doesn't work? And you have to kind of get comfortable with failure. It's interesting because in the newfangled startup tech world, there's a very high value put on failure, right? You seek to fail because if you're seeking to do more and more generative, innovative things, you're gonna fail. So in that culture, it's completely accepted that you're gonna try things and you're gonna fail. In a lot of our institutions, it's way less comfortable, especially when we're talking about funders and grants and lots of sensitive issues of how do we sustain our organizations? We don't have huge capital investments. It's hard. It's hard to take these risks. But again, that's where we come back to value, that it's in our values to have the courage to try new things and to take some risks and to do it with some compassion for ourselves and some compassion for the process. And so the last thing is all of these values take us to a place of leadership and ultimately to a place of tzedek, to a place of justice. That when we are open to opening up our tent, to learning, to doing the real work of changing things on the ground, that's what makes us leaders and that's what creates justice. So I just wanted to offer these as values and to start that as a conversation of how do you have those conversations in your organization or about what are the values that we already hold that implore us to make these changes. We have to, because it's in our values. We have to grow and become more open and become more conscious. Because I know you already want to open the tent, because you're here, I'm going to take you through a little bit of the watchfulness of the assessment piece of it. And so this is a piece from our toolkit. And again, this may or may not be the right fit for your organization. This is definitely geared more towards synagogues and camps and direct service organizations in that frame, whereas you might have a very different kind of organization, we'll have to adapt it. But you want to look practically about what your organization is doing and what they may not be doing. And so this part of the toolkit is actually like 9 pages long and goes over a number of different issues. I have 2 pieces in this packet for you to look at. And so just actually take your pen and take a minute and look through it and see if, in terms of creating a personal welcome, we have established a system so that all inquiries are followed up with a warm personal phone call or alternative contact. So just go through and check these boxes, and they're really just meant to start thinking about how you're doing this work. If it doesn't work for you, you can change the language, but it's really just meant as a template. And then when you turn the page, you have one specifically about the LGBTQ community. So you can see how some of our more specified checklists are. So you have one, this front one is very general about how to just be generally welcoming. And the original toolkit is very much about how to just be a welcoming congregation or welcoming organization generally. And then the second one is specific to a particular community. So take a few minutes and just go through and look at it. And then we'll see if you have any feedback or questions. The next piece is I wanted to just give you some broad suggestions of things that you can try on. I think of these suggestions that I'm going to make, and again, some of them will be applicable to your institution in different ways because I know there's a diversity here. But I think of them as what I call the passive income of audacious hospitality, because a lot of people think that audacious hospitality or being hospitable is all about interpersonal relationships and whether you smile at people or you have greeters. But there's a lot of things you can do that you can invest in structure and form so that even if there's no one around someone in the building, but they come in and see your institution, or they read your materials, or they find you online, they can already tell that you're thinking about these things, that you're conscious and you care. And one thing I like to say is, it really also doesn't matter if you think, and I think Baltimore, when I've given this talk in lots of different places, so there's really small communities in rural Arizona that aren't thinking, well, we may not have a very diverse group of people coming in through the door. But more and more, these are also issues that millennials really care about. And will notice that you're making an effort, and will see that you're willing to make changes. And I like to say that Gen X is actually not that ideologically different than millennials. They're just quiet, and they will walk in the door and not like what they see and walk out and not say anything. And millennials will complain, and you're lucky they complain, because then you know that there's something wrong or there's something that's uncomfortable. Gen Xers will just not engage. They'll just go do their own thing. So you don't necessarily know, and to the point where nobody even talks about them. I tried to convince the reform movement to have more programming on Gen Xers, because they're off the radar, but they're actually the next group that's coming up as young families, and they're already in that process that people are trying to engage. So I'm just going to go through some basic ideas of these structural things that you can think about. And they're not the only ideas, and there's much more in our toolkits online, and there's much more on these note cards that we'll have some time to talk about in a minute. But one of the things I want to talk about is, what do people visually see when they come into your building, when they come into your office, when they look at your website and see what kind of images you have on your website? Do any of them reflect the kind of diversity that you want to attract? This was the first image I put up in another talk, and there was the president of Shar Zahav, which is the LGBTQ synagogue in San Francisco, was in the room. And what she said to the people in the room is that if she saw this inside a synagogue somewhere, her shoulders would immediately drop. She would feel like, okay, this place has got my back on some level. They've thought about what it means to have a rainbow flag in a window somewhere. I'm okay here. I'm safer here than I might be somewhere else. So how do you put up visual cues? Do we have art of diverse Jewish families that are not all white. And I actually went as far as to give you links on how to purchase this actual art, just to let you know it's actually out there. You can actually buy this stuff or contact the artist or think about what else is out there. If you see something, think, oh, there really needs to be images of diversity. If a multiracial family comes into your organization, they can see, oh, this organization knows that Jews are a multiracial people, that we are not all white. This is a poster from the Jewish Multiracial Network. Most of those kids are parents now, but it expresses, again, that the Jewish community is very diverse. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is not just what they see on the walls, but what they see in your registration forms, in your literature. If they go into your organization, you hand them a piece of paper, whether it's a registration form, a contact form. Is it conscious of the fact that our families are made up in very different ways? You know, if I go to a doctor and it asks me, you know, if it says like husband and wife or mother and father, I, as someone who's married to a woman, don't really feel like this organization might be fully prepared. I might have to have a conversation with them. It doesn't mean I'm going to walk out the door, but it means I have to engage in order to make myself and my family feel like we really fit there. Now that we're much more aware than we used to be of the gender diversity in our community, and people are expressing gender diversity younger and younger and younger. So you have kids in elementary school who are out as non-binary or trans. And how do you deal with that if you're offering a retreat, a 5th grade retreat, or a summer camp program? How do you change the language on your form to make sure that it doesn't just say male or female? I want to also make you think about the fact that try not to use the word other as an option. So you can say not listed here, or not listed above, or give a blank space. When you say other, it makes the person really feel like they are other, or there's something other than what you're expecting. And so we want to be thoughtful about how we're framing what we write on our forms, and just that little bit of consciousness to say parent 1 and parent 2, or parent and guardian or caregiver, because we have families where the grandparent is the caregiver for the child. And also to think about additional important people in families' lives. So to leave space for a significant person who may be contributing to supporting that family. Maybe families are constructed in so many different ways now that you have either step parents or you have co-parents who may not be married taking care of children or being in relationship. And especially for LGBTQ families where marriage was not an option for such a long time, and where it was so common to be alienated from your family, there's a lot of constructed family, of created family that is really vital and important to these families' lives. And so finding a way to ask them, you know, oh, is there another important person that I can put down to make sure that those relationships are noticed. The next piece here is about inclusive language around gender. That how do you choose a gender neutral or inclusive option on your forms so that instead of men and women, you can say people or congregants or participants or members. Instead of boys and girls, you can say children or young people. And you can go down this list. So you can start thinking about whether you're doing public speaking and you're saying something in front of a group, or you're saying it in a newsletter. These shifts are not that difficult. They are new for a lot of people. The times when I'm thinking about using part of language is more when you're not talking about inclusivity necessarily. You're just saying, you know, we welcome all, are we gonna say like, we welcome all boys and girls to our Purim carnival, right? Or do we welcome all children to a Purim carnival? Can we make that shift so that the parent of a trans child doesn't feel like just a little shook by, like, just a little bit? There's always this just like ping, like, am I really included here? Like, is my kid gonna be picked on, or does this congregation even know that a kid like mine can exist, right? So just those little shifts. So when you're not, you know, that's not necessarily a time where you're gonna make a long list. Now, if you're talking about like, specifically the fact that you're going to make this effort to be inclusive, I think that is a time. And again, we are so diverse. Like, the world is so diverse, it would like fully rock our brains if we had to comprehend all of it at once. So no matter what you do, there's probably someone you're leaving out, because we've gotten to that point. But it's incredible that we live in this really diverse world. That's why, to a certain extent, the LGBTQ community sometimes puts a plus sign at the end of that list to just mean plus everybody else that we know that we can't name, because it'll take up the rest of the sheet of this paper. And so you do your best. And I think people know when you're making a good faith effort and when you're growing and when you're learning, and people will come, but when they see you making an effort, they feel more safe to even say, you know, I really want you to include me too. But I think those are some of the discernment that I do. Or a piece of registration form, any kind of the documentation, and just look at it and see, are we doing okay on this already? Have we worked on this? Is this on our radar as something that's an issue? All these institutions are different. If you're working with the city, you can use their formatting and then possibly put an additional box and say, is there other information that you're willing to share with us? I mean, as someone who's part of my Jewish family is Iraqi, and Middle Eastern is rarely ever a category on forms. You have African American and Latinx and white, but on the census, Arabs are considered white. It's very fascinating to this day. So these forms are very imperfect, and we do the best we can. And if you're negotiating those pieces, I mean, you can go to the city and also talk to them, write them a letter, and say, like, this is how your form is not serving us, and how we would like to make it better. And you can have an additional form and just let people know, like, this is what we have to do for the state, and this is how we want to engage with you. But again, we're just working through all of these things and trying to make them the best they can be. We keep sort of engaging in these conversations and trying to meet people where they're at. And names change over time. What is acceptable to call someone changes, and they get to decide that. And they get to decide that, and a parent and a child might disagree, you know, from the same family. But if we want to be welcoming, you know, there's a big conversation now of whether interfaith families want to be called interfaith families. It makes sense that they might not want to be, because it has not been a nice word necessarily in our communities. And so there's some reason, but then what do people call themselves? How do we name people? How do they name themselves? When do we meet people where they're at? And how do we do the work to do that? So I think it's also okay for people to request what they need, right? So that also has to be okay. So then I think it's worth asking the person requesting it, are you looking for men, or are you looking for people who are male identified? Because those are not, right? Which opens it up more. Within the Jewish community, we deal with a lot of gendered issues. And I know that Baltimore has one of the largest Orthodox communities in the country. I don't know how that factors into the work that you're doing, but I think that those kinds of requests come, and I think you can respond, and there are ways that you can open it up. Can you say, you know, is it okay to ask for men and people who are male identified? If somebody wants, if there's a woman who wants accompaniment to medical appointment and want someone who's female or female identified, I think that is a legitimate request. I think you open it up, and you ask them, can we open up that request? And if they say no, that's also okay. That's their request.
Tangentially related, but it comes from the forums. Made me think of it. One of the things we ask on our forums is, are you interested in participating in men's club or sisterhood? So let's go ahead and open that door.
You know, I think these are things that we're going to have to struggle with. You know, in our community, there was a time when those groups had a lot of meaning and value, and I think they still do in a lot of ways. And
That's dissipating. But
I think that you, again, would the men's group be open to everyone who's male and male identified, right? So you may want to specify that, like, in the literature for it, to say that this is a group for everyone who's male and male identified. And male identified is a way to say that a trans person who identifies as male is welcome. Now, someone who is non-binary and doesn't necessarily feel comfortable in a men's group or in a women's group or in a group that is, or doesn't feel comfortable identifying themselves with a binary gender, may struggle with the fact that these groups have been so gendered for all this time. And we, as a community, may have to think about, is this still serving everybody? Are these groups structured in this way, serving our community in the way that our community needs to be served? That is a much bigger conversation. And when your community is ready for it, you can have that conversation if that's what people are asking for, right? So again, you can make these smaller shifts of saying, this group is open to. And it could be that a lot of women's organizations have been very progressive at saying, you know, our organization is open to women, people who are women identified and non-binary. So you can open it up. One thing that we talked about after the big reform convention was that the women of Reform Judaism made these beautiful baskets of sanitary products and put them in the women's room, which was wonderful. But they didn't put them in the all-gender bathrooms, and they didn't put them in the men's rooms, which trans men require certain products, right? So can we think beyond what we're accustomed to and stretch a little more and realize that we're dealing with the fact that trans people have always existed. They're just now existing within a lot more safety in our communities to the point that they can exist openly and safely. And if we want to support that, then there's things we can do to make people feel safe and make people feel included. And are we willing to make those adjustments? Is that helpful? Okay.
I think one of the interesting things that you said in the beginning was that while, you know, we as community, and our goal to build community is to be inclusive and to welcome diversity and all of those things, and yet we have this very you know, internal sort of natural desire to be in cliques that are of like. And you know, I think that understanding that's not going to change, that part of human nature not going to change necessarily, but being able, I think maybe as a goal to say, all right, within our tremendously inclusive community, there are the opportunities to be in your small subgroup with like, and you can't be mean to the other groups, but like, I remember talking to somebody one time, it was someone Israeli, and you know, it was actually at a conference. So, you know, the conference was in English. And she said, you know, sometimes I just don't want to have to think so hard. And when I don't want to think so hard, I need to find a table of Israelis because I don't want to think in English. And I just don't want to have to be thinking all the time. And I think making safe spaces is sometimes about allowing people to have those cliques where they don't have to think so hard about, am I safe in this moment? Or, you know, what are people thinking? You know, if I go in this bathroom or that bathroom, like I want to be safe right now. And I need to be, in order to be safe, I want to be with like. And making that okay. And then I think the sort of challenging part of that is that then you're also going to hear from people who say, I just want my safe space where I don't have to worry about being nice to people that I think are blank. You know, and that's part of it too. And I think that's where the conflict is. And how do we deal with that conflict? And how do we, you know, accommodate, how do we make everyone feel safe and welcome and challenge the people for whom feeling safe and welcome, an inherent part of that is also making someone else feel unwelcome. I think there's a balance there. It's really challenging.
I mean, I do think that we need to get to the point, both as Jewish community leaders and as Americans, where no, you don't get a space where you can just be mean to other, like where it's safe. Within that safe, it's okay to be mean to other people. Like that's not something we should be comfortable with, right? We need a men's room, like, you know, like the locker room talk where it's safe to be really misogynistic. No. Like we need men in those spaces to say, guess what? This is not a safe space for you to be a misogynist and to tell us that women are horrible or whatever. No, you don't have a safe space to do that. That is not what safe space is about. So we need to redefine what safe spaces are. I think that also what happens when we do this work really well is we get to know each other in a way that even folks who may have seemed different before seems really similar now when we find our common ground because we're working to find those places of authentic relationship. And so you're able to say, oh, you know, we're all parents, and we're going to talk about being parents with parents who have parent problems, right? And we're all singles, or we're all, yes, you can have groups where you're struggling with different issues, where we want to be in spaces where we're in Jewish community, we get to feel safe in Jewish community, and that Jewish community can be brought, where that those boundaries are, we don't need to be an all straight white Jewish community, right? And as we're in greater levels of authentic relationship, we start seeing those boundaries really differently, and those boundaries naturally open up, but we have to do the work to get there. And sometimes that does, but yeah, I'm really down for like safe spaces not being the place where where you get to feel safe to be mean to anybody. There's two pieces. I think that sometimes change takes a long time, and sometimes it doesn't. I think we got used to gay marriage real fast. And in some ways, right, and not everybody, right. So we, exactly, who is we? I think that that's why the learn piece and the education piece is part of this process, is that this is why we have workshops, this is why we have conversations, that if you know that, if you have some inkling that this is going to be a problem, you can have a community conversation. You can have a staff meeting where you really talk about it ahead of time, where you might talk about it with the leadership even before that meeting, and try to set the culture in a certain way. And so that because I think that you're not going to make everyone happy. There are going to be people who are not comfortable with these changes. There are people who don't accept that I'm clergy. And, like there are people who, I'm just saying, it took a long time for the role of women to change in the Jewish community, but it has, and it hasn't for everybody. And again, that can only be our problem to a certain extent. And what we can do is sort of like the conversation we were having a minute ago, is say, if you don't agree, that's okay. There are respectful and disrespectful ways of disagreeing. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is be disagreeable in a respectful way. And this is and set a culture of respect, and say we're willing to listen only if we can have a respectful dialogue about the fact that this is, again, that's why it takes courage, is because it's not easy. People are going to have resistance to it. But we continue to educate, and it becomes more and more normal, and people even forget that it was a different way. I love the stories of little kids who are like, they grow up in a synagogue with a woman rabbi and a woman cantor, and they're like, men can be rabbis?
As organizations that value inclusion and diversity, I don't know if we're quite there yet, but at the same time, we have to be willing to put our money where our mouth is and say, this is what we value, this is, this is something that is what makes us who we are. Like, so if someone is wanting to be exclusive, or not wanting to kind of play, like not wanting to play nice with others, like, we have to be willing to be like, I'm sorry you feel that way. This is what we do. Like,
right.
These are our values, and we have to be willing to say, I'm sorry, like, we feel differently, and this is what we stand for. And I don't know if we're like, if everybody in our community is really ready to say that, and even I struggle with that, and my work directly involves inclusion. Like, that's what I do. But like, I don't even know if we're ready to say it, but we have to be willing to say that, like, this is who we are and what we believe in and what our values are. And if you don't, maybe it's not for you, but it's hard to get to that point where you're comfortable to say that.
It is, and I think especially now the world feels a lot more divided, and we don't want to exclude the people who are excluding other people. Right? We're like, we want to include you even though you want to exclude everyone else. And I think that it does. I noticed at the last training with Sherry Brown, you did some practicing of how to interrupt a racist comment or an exclusionary comment. And I think it takes courage. Again, you can come up with talking points, right? And it takes courage to just be able to repeat, like, these are our values. This is why we start from a place of what our values are, what our mission is. It is our value to be inclusive. This is the way we're practicing that value. And we'd like for you to agree with us. We understand if that's not what you're comfortable with. Are you able to be in this space even though this is the changes that are going on, or do you need to go? I mean, and it's not easy, and it's not what we want. We want people, we want to all be able to grow. And people do it at their own pace. And sometimes people need to walk away to realize that they want to come back and to know the value of it and to know that you're serious. I mean, I know in a synagogue, you can have 300 families and they're all on board, and you have that one person, you know, who is going to walk up to anybody who looks different, who walks through the door, and make them feel uncomfortable. And you can't, there's only so much you can do to control that. You can have conversations with that person, and you can make sure that you're doing everything else that you can in your institution to make sure that people feel welcome. We know we can't solve everything all the time. You know, this is why, like, this is not a process of perfection. You know, we're not going to be perfect at this. This is about relationships. And if anybody thinks about their relationships with their spouse or their parents or their children, these are not perfect relationships, right? But we need to be willing to be in relationship and to say, like, you matter to me. We care about you. We care about whether you feel like you belong here, and we're not going to get it right. And when we get it wrong, we say we're sorry, and we see what we can do to fix it and to try to adjust.
Focus that for a lot of our conversation has been around gender identity. But when I think about inclusivity, I'm reminded of so many larger groups that that one would say that the hearing impaired community or visually impaired are not stigmatized. However, are we all doing as much as we can to be inclusive when it comes to that? Those, and I just mentioned two, but there's so many populations that have, I think, identified, what was your word, the cliques, because they may not have found a comfort zone in our institutions. And the point was made, for some of this, there can be great expense. And I'm not going to pick on OHEP, but you mentioned, and not OHEP, but you just said sisterhoods and brotherhoods, and wherever they may be held, are they accessible? Are they in the room that has steps? Are they here? Are they there? How much have we done for those communities to make them feel inclusive, which has been an issue for longer than I have been in the field, which is a long time. So just not to forget.
Absolutely.
The broader range.
No, absolutely. And I know I'm not touching on everything, and I realized that, so for the last year, I was the editor of the LGBTQ and the Jews of Color toolkit, so that's where my brain went. So that's a lot of how this presentation got created. But and we have an entire department that deals specifically with inclusivity of people with different abilities, and that's not my specific realm of expertise, but that is absolutely something that is important. And the hope is that as you, which is exactly what has happened, as you start thinking about these things, it starts making you think of all of the different communities in your congregation, in your organization, in your participant pool, who you can bring in, who need services, who have been sort of calling out for increased participation, and what you need to do to meet that.
The intermarrieds, people who are intermarried or interfaith or all those other things, which is, we still look at intermarriage as a disease, and that is across all movements. There's never this, like, it's always a shame, it's always an embarrassment, it's always something that we don't really want, and that we spend all this time, and we have all this literature and all this stuff, is like, keep our kids together, whatever, and the tent still, I know that like in some ways, like the Big Tent Treaties and whole thing started a lot of ways with trying to be inclusive of interfaith families, which is funny, which is not what we consider ourselves, because my husband doesn't consider himself a person of faith, so he feels like that's a very odd thing to say. But we were, but people get called, when you get called the intermarrieds, it becomes, which has happened here, there's still a stigma, and it doesn't matter if you're in a Reform congregation, Reconstructionist, conservative, it's still looked down upon, and you still sort of walk in with your head down a little bit. And like, there's no rainbow star window thing that says like, come one, come all, you intermarrieds, like, because we're still the problem. And I always felt like when we exclude the intermarrieds, that the Jews that are connected to them also leave the tent. So how do we, and so we're just, that's why. Like, is it the fault of intermarriage, or is it the fault of the community that Jews are no longer don't feel part of the community if they have married somebody from some other thing besides Judaism?
We could definitely do an entire workshop on interfaith families and marriage. Absolutely. And I think that, again, once you start saying that inclusivity is important, people start speaking up and saying what they need. And there isn't like one solution. It's interesting. Honeymoon Israel is a program. I don't know if there is one in Baltimore. There is not. There may be. They're relatively new. DC is the closest one. So Honeymoon Israel has been coming out with some new conversation about it because they really center interfaith couples. They're not just for interfaith couples, but there's a lot of interfaith participants, and they center their experience in a new way that is sort of changing the conversation around these issues. But there's a lot of work we have to do. We have to believe that cultural changes can happen, and they happen all the time, right? But they happen with intention, and they happen a lot of times with institutional leadership. Right? We get to make those changes. So again, you think about all of the different interactions you have with your institution and where you can begin to make those changes. Whether it's to really openly welcome people, whether it's to provide specific programming to bring people together. But you start thinking about what are you in the position to change, and how can you start making that change happen, like progressively, and learning and growing, right? Reading what newer organizations are doing to shift the culture and to make couples feel more comfortable and feel more safe. The Reform movement is starting an officiation service, which is a huge deal. It's a huge deal that there's a movement that says, like, if you can't find somebody to marry you, we will help you find somebody to marry you, because that is not a crime that you should be, that you should feel excluded from Jewish community and Jewish ritual. So that's even 20 years ago, the Reform movement was nowhere near, even right now, sometimes the Reform movement's nowhere near doing that. It is really a push. It is really a step in a pretty bold direction. But there's the idea that there's the beginning of the capacity to make that change, a change that people have been crying out for decades. So things do change. Sometimes they change slowly, sometimes they change rapidly, but it is possible. So if people are coming in, they can just join. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the ones go to the opportunities board and just read what's on there and have. So if you walk over there, and we'll have some questions once you get there. The 2s will go to the challenges, and the 3s will go to the successes. Take a second to read through. I know you can help each other with the handwriting a little bit. And after you've had a moment to just look it over, have everyone grab one. I think there's enough for everybody. Have everybody grab one and pick a partner. And think about, okay, why was this a success? Why do you think this would be successful, even if it wasn't yours? Why was this one a challenge? Why is this one an exciting thing to take on? Why would somebody want to take this on right now? And so pick a partner and just talk about for each of the ones you picked. Now what we want to do is choose a partner. And even though we're not going to go through the slides for it, there's 3 components of what I want to go through about thinking about what changes you're willing to make. And again, we have the challenges up here because we want to make changes that might fail. We want to be bold enough that it may not work. There may be challenges, and that's okay. So to think big enough that it might even not work, don't just do what's safe. But what I want you to do is pick a partner now and think of one change you want to make in your organization, something that is under your purview, preferably, or you want to petition the people who are in charge of that decision to make a change, and what steps would it take to either educate them or have that conversation. So the pieces that I want you to think about for a second: who can you get to help you so you don't have to do this alone? Who can you get to know better at your organization? Who can you enlist? A lot of organizing is done through relationship. And so if you're going to organize to have a change, either you want to have a coffee date with somebody who this change might impact. If you have if you want to make a change around interfaith families, having a conversation with someone who's in an intermarriage or in an interfaith family, talking to them about what their needs are. So either someone who's impacted by this change, or who's in control, or who can just help the process. So who are 2 or 3 people who you can have coffee dates with in the next 2 to 3 months to start thinking about what you want to change and how you can change it. So take a moment, write down one thing that you're interested in making a change at your organization about, and then pick your partner. And what I want you to do is state what that change is, and I want your partner to give you 2 pieces of affirmation, 2 statements of saying, that is really great because, and then one question, one question about how you're going to do it, one question about what's the value behind it, what's motivating you to want to make that change. So 2 affirmations. I want it to be a little structured, that you feel a little push around it. So one change that you want to make in your organization based on the last 3 sessions that you've had about inclusivity, whether it's about just learning new things, or changing policy, changing your forms, changing your website. If you go on your website and it talks about families, and all 3 pictures of the families that you have on the families page all look exactly the same, that might be a change you want to make. I've been on some of your websites, that is the case. So you want to just think about what is the one change that you'd like to make over the course of the next year, and state that change to a partner. And then the partner will give you 2 pieces of affirmation and 1 question, and then we'll switch. So we're going to take 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to just state the question and get the affirmations, and then 2 minutes to ask questions, and then we'll switch. Does anybody want to share something that they're willing to take a stand on, that they're interested in making a change on in this next year? And how they're going to solicit support?
So something that I am very interested in, I work with older adults, and I think that we experience a lot of ageism. And I would like to develop a class on sensitivity towards ageism to give to our property managers, because I oversee the Weinberg Senior Living buildings. Because I think that a lot of times they come in and they've got affordable housing education under their belt, and they're ready to go, and they know about diversity because of fair housing, but they don't think about what it's like to actually work with an aging population, because there's a set of needs that are different than if you're working in a family population. So I think that that's something that's really important. And just like basic aging 101, and this is why this person's acting this way, and this is how you can better react to it.
And these are sometimes deep conversations where you have to have like multiple levels, right? Like a lot of college campuses get in trouble because they have these beautiful photos and they want to show diversity. So they have like the same student. There's like one student, and that one student, right? Or like he's a real person that goes to their college, but he's on every photo, right? Maybe with or without his consent. So you want to make sure that you're not tokenizing people. You want to make sure that you get people's consent to use their image, that they're comfortable representing your organization. You want to have like thoughtful, multi-level conversations about who's looking at this, how are they looking at it, what are their privacy issues. Again, like these are just conversations we have to make sure that we're in relationship and in respectful conversation. People sometimes say, oh, well, there's that one person, right? And you bring them in for that reason. People want to be seen as full people. If someone's brought on, they're brought on like everyone else to have their full opinion, not just for a particular issue or particular community or racial identity or ethnic identity or sexuality. They want to be there just like everybody else is there for their full selves. And you need to know that that's why they're there. What's happening is that our Jewish community and our world is getting more diverse. The United States is getting more diverse, and we have to be ready for it. We want people to engage in our programs. We want to be prepared. When you go to youth programs in major cities across this country, in Jewish youth programs, you see 3 times the level of diversity that you may have seen 10, 15, 20 years ago. We need to start changing our teen programs now to be ready for the wave of kids that are in elementary school, right? So we start thinking about, the Pew study for the Jewish community didn't even include a question on race, right? So that is just a blind spot to think there is a diversity of racial identities within the Jewish community. This is something that we need to understand and talk about. We're not even asking the questions. So how do we ask the right questions? How do we prepare before people get in the door so that once they're there, they want to stay? Because part of the reason there might be, only one person that we think about is that's the person with the thick skin who's used to being the only person who gets called out for, and so we want to make sure that everybody, even folks who don't have that level of tolerance for other people's misunderstandings, that we have these conversations now, that we start preparing for the wave of diversity that we already know is coming on every level, because identity is something that people are more comfortable talking about. I'm going to share one last thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful leaders who have a lot of resources to share you, but I just wanted to share you. So this is really personal for me. Said that I was going to use this photo. My wife was like, everybody's going to think that you're marrying your brother. It hadn't even occurred to me, what that perception was, what you were saying, what do people see when they see this photo? So this is me and my brother and his wife in the gray dress. This is my wedding, and that's my wife. And of course, my wife would see that because she goes into Jewish communities, and nobody realizes that her grandmother was the daughter of a freed slave and a British Jew. And so she comes as a fully identified Jewish person, and nobody, like they say about April Baskin, who I work with, she walks in a room with Rick Jacobs, who's her boss, and they hand him a siddur and her a brochure, right? Because she's a person of color. They hand me the siddur, they hand my wife a brochure. And so we want to get to the point where we have a broad enough understanding of what the Jewish community looks like that you realize that everybody in this picture is Jewish. Whether it's a Jew by choice, a Jew by birth, a Jew from an interracial or interfaith family, right? That our vision of what the community looks like is big enough to realize that we don't know somebody's story when they walk in the door, but we want them to know that this is the place for them, that they feel safe. Whether the ways in which they're different is visible or not, or ways that we're very accustomed to seeing, like older people, but we still haven't hit it on how to make them feel really safe. So we just want to keep having these conversations, because this is what our Jewish values demand of us. This is what they lead us to do. This is what they command of us, that they ask of us. So I hope that this has been helpful to all of you in the pursuit of making change and creating more tzedek and more justice in the world. And here's the toolkits. If you're interested, there's lots more resources in our toolkits.
Let's thank Cantor, Shira Stanford, I see you one more time for being with us today. We want to share something with you that's hot off the press. We've been talking about it since January, and we want to announce the release of the DFI Diversity and Inclusion Toolkit. It is live. We thank DFI and Aviva and her team that she's been working with really hard on the toolkit itself. So I'm just going to share a couple of things with you about the toolkit. This is the first toolkit of its kind, where it is curated by professionals for professionals. And all of the content that's in the toolkit is information that we as professionals have found helpful for us, that then we want to share it with others if you're also looking for resources that can help you in your work. The toolkit is a space that will change over time based on its content. So as we dig in more and add things to the toolkit, then it'll evolve and change over time. So I'm going to turn it over to Aviva so she can walk us through some of the logistics of the toolkit.
Thank you all for being here on behalf of DFI and Sherelle and Lara. This is a huge project that we've worked on, and we really couldn't have done any of this without you. The toolkit was created as a culmination of the work that we've done in this workshop series and also last year's diversity and inclusion cohort. We built this website as the final project, but really the ongoing project. The purpose of this is to create, again, as Sherelle said, a space where we can continue the work and share with each other. We have education programs and training, which is where you can find resources on how to have difficult conversations or assessments for your organization or synagogue, personal assessments, resources for your programs or actually programming them itself. Another thing that we have are lists of organizations that may be helpful to you in your work. Jewish Learning is where we have our framework for Jewish text. All the work that we've done so far and have yet to do really can be framed within a Jewish perspective. We look forward to growing this resource as well. And lastly, we have Personal Perspectives, which is a space for you to add your own stories, but if you've come across an article that's been helpful, but it's less educational and more of a personal perspective, but is still useful as a resource, we encourage you to post that here as well. The purpose of this toolkit is to enable all organizations to have access to a full range of resources, Jewish resources, educational modules, to encourage dialogue and organizational change, cultural shifts that really help bring this back home on a personal level, on an organizational level, the work that we're doing here today. And we encourage all of you to create a profile to use, to share with each other, bring it back home to your organizations, whether that's through social media, whether that's through an email campaign, or just even sharing it with one or two colleagues that aren't present here today. It's really important that we bring home that this is a community. It's an online community, but it's just a small representation of our larger, broader Jewish community.
As Aviva was saying, we want this toolkit to be used. So we would like to ask everyone, if you haven't already done so, please go to the dfi.org/toolkit website, and on the upper right-hand corner, you can create a profile. It's really easy to create your profile, and then you will get an email that lets you know that you're registered and that your profile is active. Takes less than 5 minutes to create your profile. And then go back to your offices after you create your profile. Encourage someone else within your organization to create one and start using the toolkit. And then finally, as one of our steps that we learned in our second session as far as leadership, if it's possible for you to add the toolkit as a topic to standing committee meetings or staff meetings that you have within your organization, please add it to the agenda so that it is always a topic that is at the top of everyone's mind, as far as maybe there's something that you have added to the toolkit recently, or you found a good resource that might be helpful for others. This is a living, breathing document that we want to have as much content curated in it as we can. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Make sure you do your evaluations and have a wonderful rest of your Monday.